that.
Good.
So, good morning, everybody. Let's try again. I want to just give a warm welcome to Councilwoman Sandoval and the team. Naomi Grundwitz, raise your hand, wave at Naomi. And Barge and Christopher Johnson from the city. Councilwoman Sandoval, would you like to say hi for a minute?
Sure. Good morning, everyone, and I hope everyone had a really good Thanksgiving. I know it looks very different this year than in previous years, but we still have lots to give thanks for. I'll say that I am thankful for Naomi and Abe and Christopher on this process. We have, I'll let Naomi do most of the talking, but some of this work predates me being in office. Before I was elected, I worked in Councilman Espinosa's office, and prior to that, I worked in Councilwoman Judy Montero's office. And what I found was that I could really make a difference in land use and zoning, where we see a lot of that happening in Northwest Denver. I feel like if there's something in the zoning code and there's some type of loophole, we'll find it in Northwest Denver, and we're trying to rectify it. So these two projects that Naomi is about to go over are really coming from community. They are grassroots, and I'm just lucky enough to be the one who can carry them forward for the residents of Northwest Denver. But I would really also like to say, in my thinking about being thankful, I'm thankful for groups like this. I'm grateful for the opportunity for people to come together and talk and discuss things and figure out solutions for our city. It really takes all of us coming together. Although I'm elected, it's the power by the people, and these groups are really by the people. So thank you all for volunteering your time to these type of organizations. I think it makes Denver a greater place to represent and live. And with that, I'll hand it over to Naomi.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilwoman. So I'm going to be giving a presentation for the two overlays that we're talking about today, and we'll have time for Q&A after each of them. We're going to start with Harkness Heights. I think that is of great interest to a lot of people here, and we'll probably have the bulk of the time for that. And then I have an hour, correct?
Yes.
Awesome. So I think maybe around 10:10 or so, a little bit over the half-hour mark, we'll close that discussion and switch over to the main streets, active centers and corridor overlay. So I'm going to start with Harkness Heights and share my screen here. And before we get going, I want to acknowledge some of our Harkness Heights neighbors who are on this call right now. First and foremost, Tom Mobley, who has been the heart and soul of this project. If anyone else here is from Harkness Heights, feel free to use the raise your hand function so that we can acknowledge you and people can see who you are. When we get to the Q&A portion, community members are available to talk, especially Tom. Again, he's been involved in all of this the longest, and he has a lot of knowledge and experience. So, all right, here we go. Can everyone see the presentation? Fabulous. All right. So the Harkness Heights Conservation Overlay. We'll start with sort of a description of what is an overlay. And I also want to acknowledge Abe Barge on the call has been working along with Brad Johnson and Libby Adams on this. A lot of these slides have information from that Brad put together for our planning board info item. So I want to give him credit for a lot of content in this presentation. So we'll talk a little bit about what an overlay is, why we chose a conservation overlay to address the issues in Harkness Heights. And then I'll go into a little bit about our process, because I've heard that people are interested in how the heck do you get something like this done, and what are best practices. And then of course, we'll talk about what is actually in the overlay in this final iteration and open it up to Q&A. So first off, a conservation overlay is meant to preserve specific characteristics of an existing neighborhood. It is not, however, a landmark designation or historic designation those are both very, very restrictive. So if we kind of think about the levels of getting more and more restrictive requirements, historic designation is very restrictive and involves going through landmark board. But if what you're going after is more of preserving key elements and key characteristics, but still allowing variation and allowing transformation, then a conservation overlay is a good choice. So in order to get going on a conservation overlay, you do need to do some good research and categorize and catalog what those distinctive features are. So they could be an age of a neighborhood, style, size, scale, mass, any of these things on the slide here. And then for those who aren't familiar, the way an overlay works is that it really does overlay on top of existing zoning. So there are rules, there's existing zoning for every part of the city. This can modify some of those things, but it sits on top of it. So baseline regulations stay in place. When there's a difference, the overlay takes precedent. But also, very importantly, conservation overlays can't change uses inside of a zone district. So for instance, Harkness Heights is a residential neighborhood. It's a residential zone district. This overlay cannot change that base fact, but it can change physically how things manifest. So there are currently 5 conservation districts or overlays, sorry, in the Denver zoning code. They're all really, really fascinating. A lot of our inspiration came from the Potter Highlands Conservation. I definitely encourage you to check out some of these neighborhoods like Crisana Park, which is a really fantastic neighborhood, more kind of modern style. But this would be the 6th. It would be Conservation Overlay 6. And that generic name, the planning department helped us. This was a very back and forth iterative process with them. And the reason this isn't necessarily called the Harkness Heights overlay is because they thought that what we had come up with was so useful to protecting neighborhoods with similar characteristics throughout the rest of the city, that little more generic name of bungalow kind of sets it up for being able to be applied other places. So as for background, where is Harkness Heights? If you're not familiar with it, it's a beautiful neighborhood up here, technically in the Berkeley neighborhood. It's a subset of that. It's relatively small. There are 339 parcels zoned USUC. So that's a single unit C. The C refers to kind of an average lot size. There's a couple of other parcels in there that are a little different, but we're focusing on applying this mainly just to that zone district. And this is a pretty consistent subdivision. One of the earliest subdivisions started around 1903 and the following decades. It's pretty consistently bungalow forms, but there are definitely some 4 squares, there are some tutors. So there is a bit of diversity, but it's very bungalow. The concerns that the neighborhood started to have are primarily the ones up on the screen here. And this is kind of what we dialed down into as our guiding principles throughout this whole process. So a big one was scale and massing. This picture illustrates, and with the caveat, these are horrible designs. They are not meant to be super realistic, but except the one in the middle is kind of, that's a typical 1-story bungalow that you would find in Harkness Heights. The purple boxes on the picture below, that's the bulk plane. That's the invisible kind of glass box that constrains development that can happen under the current zoning code. And unfortunately, for Harkness Heights with these little bungalows, what you are allowed to build inside that box, inside that glass box, is really out of character with the scale and the massing of what's there. So that's what those 2 kind of monstrosities on either side are. Again, those aren't necessarily super realistic, but in terms of massing, yes, you could build something that big. So another thing we wanted to address was siting and building width, the relationship of the street. So really, what makes Harkness Heights when you walk down the street? And how can we preserve that? And then privacy was also another value. The objectives that came out of this was to basically ensure that when new development happens, because it will, because this is not a historic district, it's not completely preserved as is, but when new development does happen, whether that is hopefully not a scrape, but maybe a pop top or something, that it actually feels like it fits in with the rest of the neighborhood more than what we're seeing in other neighborhoods, what can currently happen. Also, that privacy and solar access is maintained, and that the setbacks and where the buildings are positioned on the lots is maintained. And that there's this rhythm, this kind of rhythm of porches and stairs and 1-story and then 2-story is preserved because it's so cohesive currently. But that there's also a bit of design flexibility. And that was a lot of community conversations about this. This is a long process of basically keeping to these, drilling down to these core values. So our process, I'm saying that community discussion started in 2016. It might have been before. Tom can pop in and correct me later. He has been so instrumental in this from the beginning. But this has been a long process. And former Councilman Espinoza was incredibly involved. He brought along some consultants, Pelona, who worked with the community to develop this first top draft, which included tons of background information and research and the foundation for the proposals that we used going forward. After Councilwoman Sandoval was sworn in, transitioned the project over to her, and I got involved. I was involved actually a little bit as an intern with Pelona, but then I was brought in to work with Councilwoman in her office. And so it was great to have that continuity. Overall, we have had multiple town halls. There was a huge one held with Councilman Espinoza that tons of people in the neighborhood attended. And there's been a very kind of voting and neighborhood buy-in and outreach heavy focus for this process. We then also held 2 town halls. This was pre-COVID, so they were in person, and we got pretty good attendance. We also relied on a community-wide survey about the elements in one of these versions that we were putting forward. And we based some decisions off of the feedback we got from the full community. Other than that, we had a process that, again, was very, very iterative. And if anyone is, of course, interested about this in further depth, you're welcome to contact me, but anybody else in the team, and we can kind of go into the details of this. We had a small group of kind of dedicated people who really dug into the details, including myself and sometimes the planning department. We had a larger task force of maybe 20 people. And then, of course, we did go back to the entire community as much as we could at certain points. But we had this cyclical process of refinement. So the proposal I'm going to show tonight is a little different than what's been seen over the last couple of years. And that's a result of a lot of work. So from proposal, we'd get group buy-in from various levels and then do really significant modeling and testing. So talking to architects, myself doing research, and then of course, going to the planning department who provided a lot of really great feedback. From that, coming up with refinement and suggestions and maybe a new proposal that then we would go back and vet with the community. So we went through this process again and again until we came down to these final elements that were both easier to administer. So from the planning department side, like they need to be able to actually administer these things. They make sense fitting in with the rest of the zoning code, as well as they adhere to the core values that the community has expressed from the beginning. And then also taking out things that might have been extraneous, or when we, polled the community, people were like, no, we don't want that. So, with this whole process, I think my biggest advice is to be humble and be flexible and recognize that there's going to be a lot of work involved. All right, so let's get to the content of the overlay. So there are 4 kind of main issues that this overlay addresses with around, I think, 9 elements. So scale and massing, side setbacks, elements that apply to low slope roofs versus pitched roofs, and then some things that are traditional design elements, such as that are called exceptions that can happen. So quick overview. For those who aren't familiar with this glass box that I referenced, the bulk plane, this is that, again, that invisible boundary that contains development to a degree. And this is specifically in our zone district that we're talking about, USUC. You can imagine for a downtown, this box looks very different. It's like 20 stories high and stuff. So this is how a house would fit into this glass box. And this is a good example here because you can see there's a few exceptions. Porches can stick out, some eaves can stick out, this little, part of the top of the roof can stick out. But in general, a house has to fit into this glass box. So this is what the glass box looks like currently. And I wanted to show this to you because I think it illustrates exactly why we made some decisions and how they're going to help new development fit in better. So currently, you can build up to 30 feet in height, and actually a little higher on wider lots, but generally 30 feet and 2.5 stories. So what that means, half story is kind of weird, but it doesn't mean in height, it means kind of in square footage. So a half story does kind of look like a third story sometimes from the street. It just means that the footprint of that story is smaller than the stories below it. So one thing that this rule was leading to is what people object to is kind of that wedding cake look, or 2 stories with more of a contemporary house with then that little, I don't know, some people call it like a dog house on top that's maybe access to a rooftop patio. So that's why 2.5 stories can allow that. Then we've got this 45-degree sort of shearing on the side. This helps with solar access and again, keeps development in. Currently, it starts at 17 feet up, measured up from the side of your property. Then we've got setbacks. They happen in the front and the sides and the rear, and that helps place the building on the lot so that it's not like all the way towards the front or crowding onto the neighbor's property or too far into the alley. And then there's also an overall lot coverage, but other than that, there's not a restriction on kind of the square footage of a house. You just can't physically build more than 37.5% of your lot, and that includes like garages and everything. So this is what we have currently. This is what the overlay does. The pink box. So it shrinks that buildable space in such a way that when a new building does come along, it's going to, so one thing we kept in mind is this going to be a feasible building, of course, under our new bulk plan? And is it going to look and fit in better than something that would be under the current bulk plan? We tested this a lot. So our new bulk plan start height here is 14 feet, the start of that 45-degree angle. So that already brings it down a little bit. We are going to have lower height limits and also differentiate those by pitched roofs versus low sloped or flat roofs. And then there's some changes to the side setbacks. And also very importantly, the community decided that it was valuable to them to actually have a limit on square footage. So I will talk about all of these things in a little bit more detail now. So side setbacks, Harkness Heights has a really consistent pattern of larger setbacks on the south side. And this was probably very deliberate, allowing, especially in the winter, sun access to not have your building ideally shade the building next to it. And so we wanted to preserve that siding pattern, also keeping the houses a little narrower, not taking up the entire width of the lot, which looks very out of character. So the new rules are still kind of graduated for how wide your lot is, but it mandates that a larger setback is on the southern side. And then back to this idea of the actual square footage cap. We had a lot of discussion about this in the community. We ended up basing this on the current largest homes that are in the area. So you can see there, the biggest one is just over 3,000 square feet. And this was in response to kind of seeing some of the homes that have been built, I would say probably around Sloan's Lake area, that are up to 5,000, 6,000 square feet, replacing smaller, more modest bungalows and building gigantic homes that feel very out of context. So there are provisions here, this additional 40 square feet for every 100 square feet of lot area. That means if you have a gigantic lot, you could build a bigger house. That's how it is there currently. There's these beautiful grand homes, especially on the corners, that are a little bit bigger, like these biggest ones here. So again, this does not apply to basements. incentivizing basements was a big goal of the community. A lot of the existing homes have basements. It's a great way to add livable square footage without adding to the bulk of the structure above ground. All right, building height in feet and stories. So we have two different height caps. If you want to build a more traditional pitched roof house, you can build that up to 28 feet. If you want to build a more contemporary, low sloped is the technical term for flat in the zoning code. If you want to build that, you can build it, but it has to be no more than 22 feet height. In addition, if you build a flat or low slope roof structure, you have to step back the second story. And this is to mimic the slope that would happen normally, that kind of sense of mass decreasing that you get with a low slope roof, and help it fit in better with the existing pitched roofs in the community. Another important thing that we took from the Potter Highlands overlay is actually allowing dormers. They're a great way to add more livable space to a second story, super traditional, and they just needed a little bit of a rule tweak to allow them in the zoning code so they can poke through that glass box, as you can see in this picture here. And getting near the end, porches, requiring porches. Porches, so currently an entry feature or a door of some sort is required, of course, if you build a new house. But Harkness Heights is characterized by these beautiful giant porches. They do a couple of things. They provide for a sense of transition from public to private realm, a chance for neighbors to sit out on their porch and interact with other neighbors, as well as this kind of, again, sloping of mass. You have a smaller one-story kind of mass, and then you get the bulk of the house behind it. So super important characteristic. So we are requiring porches. Again, this stuff applies generally to a brand new build. If you have one of these homes on this page, for instance, and you want to build a second story, you're not going to be required to like build a brand new porch if your porch isn't big enough. A lot of these really just apply to brand new builds. So minimum porch size, minimum porch dimensions, it has to have some sort of little wall or fence around it. It has to have a roof, and it can't be recessed underneath a story. It can't be kind of like a cave that you go into. It actually has to stick out. And getting close to the end here, upper surface of first floor. So if you notice, a lot of traditional design has kind of a base and then a first story and then the stories above it. Whereas some contemporary architecture, such as the image to the far right, is just built sort of slab on grade. And it disrupts the rhythm that's very, very, very consistent in this neighborhood. So this rule requires there to be between 1 foot and maximum 3 foot, a sense of elevation. So a stair, a couple of stairs on that first floor. And lastly, part of that privacy value that we mentioned at the beginning, this also is similar to Potter Highlands, prohibiting rooftop decks. So originally, this was something where we went through a lot of changes going back to the greater community. People do like their decks, but we could all agree that an actual rooftop deck wasn't great. And so that was from privacy concerns, as well as sort of the form of a house that would allow that. It's generally more contemporary homes, but with flat roofs, of course, on the top. But this, similar to Potter Highlands, prohibits rooftop or decks on top of a second story. So here's the summary of all the 9 elements that we talked about, and I will open it up to Q&A. So I think we have a good 15 or more minutes for just question and answer. I'm here to answer questions. The councilwoman is here. We've got Tom Mobley from Harkness Heights. We've got Abe Barge from the planning department, and we'll just let her rip.
My name's David Pardo. I actually live in Lohi. All of this makes sense. I think it's a really cool thing that you guys have put together here. My only real question is related to the minimum first floor elevation. If somebody, I'm not, but I'm going to channel Councilman Chris Hines here. If somebody is in a wheelchair, having your first floor have to be above grade, it adds that it's just something that's a concern to me. It's like there are people for whom having their home at grade makes their house much more livable because of their physical handicaps. And I'm wondering, is that something that was thought about and potential solutions to it? Is somebody allowed to have a 12-to-1 sloped entry up to their porch, or are they required to have stairs? That's really the extent of my question.
Yeah, thanks, David. That is a good question. And yes, we have thought about this a lot. You're not the first person to bring it up. And we talked about it in the community, and also Planning Board has had this question. So we've talked to architects, to the landmarks, the Department of Human Rights and Community Partnerships. So it's interesting. It's good. It's a good question. So nothing prevents you from building a ramp. You do not have to have stairs. In fact, there is a provision that we've written into the overlay that very explicitly allows any sort of ramp or anything needed to modify for accessibility to come into one of those front setbacks. And then also there is a, what do you call this? A relief valve for this. So there's the Board of Adjustments. So anyone who had due to any sort of desire for accessibility to build, again, a brand new house, this wouldn't apply to an existing structure. Anyone who wanted to can go through the Board of Adjustments. You can get a variance to do that. So there is that relief valve. So for all those reasons, we feel that for the majority of, again, brand new homes that might be built, this is something that's really important to preserve the patterns in the neighborhood. And if you do have any sort of mobility access issue, there's a couple of different workarounds and ways that you can get around that. So it would not prohibit someone from having an accessible home. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that definitely answers it. Thank you for explaining the process and what you guys have written in. That's awesome.
Definitely. Thank you so much for the question.
Okay, I don't know if Ian is here. I'm going to run the questions, but I'm just going to do Cindy Estrich asked a series of questions, and some have been answered. Should we go through them?
Sure.
Okay, so Cindy asked if you expect this to decrease or eliminate demos. And the councilwoman said, yes, that's our hope. And Michael Henry said there haven't been as many in Harkness Heights, as many demolitions. So anything you want to add to that, Councilwoman or Naomi?
Sure, it looks like.
I would just add that one of the things when I was working with Councilwoman Montero is that was the discussion for the conservation overlay in Potter Highland. And it's a little bit different because Potter Highland is a historic district. But the year of significance, which if nobody on this call knows what the year of significance is in a historic district, it's the year attached. And then after that year, structures can usually be demoed if they're not a contributing structure. So what was happening in Highland, in Potter Highland, was a lot of the blonde 50s ranches were being demoed in the Potter Highland Historic District. And they were being, the infill was not matching the characteristic of the houses there. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to make sure that we allowed expansion of homes. And so we hope that this tool works the same as Potter Highland, where you're getting some homes that are smaller. I live in a 1943 Tudor home. It's pretty small. I functioned well with my 2 kids and my husband, I will admit. My daughter moved out, and so it seems like we have a lot more room now that there's 3 of us. But for that, I would love to use this overlay to make sure that we're popping the tops and keeping families within Northwest Denver, and that the infill and homes kind of take cue from the built environment.
Thank you. Ian, okay, well, Cindy asked also.
I see. I hear you here.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Did you get Paige's question here? I don't think you did.
No, and I didn't get Cindy Sestrich's last question.
Okay.
Okay, let's go to pages here. How does this differ from an HOA that may have a requirement on roofs or fences?
That's a really good question. I know HOAs are private agreements, and I might ask Abe to jump in here and help me answer this too. But that's something that you enter into privately, whereas this is recorded in zoning. So there's a public process like the one we're going to have to go through to adopt all of this. Whereas an HOA, your HOA could get together and vote on new rules. That's not a public process. That's a private process within the HOA. Whereas here, in order to establish the overlay in the beginning and then in the future to change it, it has to go through a whole hearing. It has to be approved with public hearings, with public input, and finally by city council. And I do believe that HOAs can put restrictions in place that zoning doesn't do. But I'm not super familiar with how HOA law is and how they all work. Anyone else want to add?
I would just say this is Abe with CBD. Yeah, I think that was a great answer, Naomi. I mean, HOAs are basically private legal agreements among property owners, and there's a lot of similar things that you could do in an HOA to zoning, but oftentimes, you're familiar with some of the HOA requirements that go a lot further in some cases, like what color you have to paint your mailbox, or what kind of chair you have to have on your porch in my old HOA, for example. But some of the things brought up in the question about like requirements regarding roofs or fences, technically those are things you could address in an overlay zone. That's a pretty high level of detail to get to, though.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes to, Cindy had a question too about like, what about building materials? Did we think about that? That's something that can't necessarily go in a conservation overlay, right? The design overlay may allow that, or that's something an HOA could do. But again, that could get down to a lot of specificity that we didn't necessarily want to be overly restrictive with.
And in
Amy, I think you're entering into that same conversation here about, maybe Abe, can you talk about the difference between the tool of a historic district versus a conservation overlay and where that line is defined? And then I see a follow-up question here that I think could be answered at the same time, which is, can you have a design overlay and a conservation overlay on the same property?
Great question, Ian.
Yeah, so to Cindy's question first about conservation overlays and design overlays for the same property, I think the answer is yes. Interesting, the code explicitly says you can't have two conservation overlays that apply to the same property. I know you can have more than one design overlay that applies to the same property, and I think you can have a design overlay and a conservation overlay. In terms of what actually exists in Denver, there aren't properties that have both. And then Ian, you were asking about historic districts versus conservation overlays. That's something we could, probably talk about for hours. And I was just looking for a presentation we put together a couple of years ago that kind of tried to characterize the differences. But I would say, like at the highest level, historic district is really the tool to use when the objective is totally about preserving the existing character of a place as embodied through the actual buildings that are there. So it's about like historic built fabric. And in a historic district, when something, Councilwoman Sandoval brought up the period of significance, when something is basically historic within the district, generally it's pretty hard to demolish it because the whole purpose of the historic district is about keeping that actual fabric. Historic districts also then would address the character of new construction, but the difference with a conservation overlay is that it's pretty much just about addressing the character of new construction. So it's all about ensuring that the character of the neighborhood or the design context of the neighborhood is maintained even as things are demolished and rebuilt over time, if that makes sense.
Great. I see a question about what date determines historic. That's an interesting one. Does anybody, Gosh.
Wait, before we leave this, the question was asked and not answered. What if you have an HOA and a conservation overlay simultaneously? If there's a conflict, which takes precedent?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So basically, an HOA can't countermand zoning regulations or counter them, for example, by being less restrictive than zoning. So if the zoning said that there was a maximum of 2 stories in height, the HOA can't say, no, actually you can build 3 stories. But an HOA, like a conservation overlay, for example, could be more restrictive. The HOA could say, no, we property owners have agreed and signed this legal document that we will not build taller than 1 story, even though the zoning allows 2. That is possible. So essentially, you know, when there's multiple things going on, the more restrictive of the things is the one that will take precedent. I want to note though that, you know, HOAs, again, that's not a city thing. That's just a private legal agreement among property owners. And, you know, in some cases, like the city wouldn't necessarily even know what the rules were unless, you know, we dug into the legal details of them, because we're not enforcing those rules. It's just privately enforced.
So I see another question from Mark. So Mark, Harkness Heights doesn't allow accessory dwelling units right now. So we didn't build for that. So that was something that Harkness Heights had a long conversation about, our accessory dwelling units. And so we don't have any regulations on accessory dwelling units at this time because they're not they're not allowed within the zoning. Everybody would have to apply individually to get a accessory dwelling unit. But that is a good question because we had that same question asked to us at the Denver Planning Board. And so that's something that maybe we can take on if that's what the community would like to see, if that's what the members and residents of Harkness Heights would like us to do. But for right now, it's not within the zoning code, so we did not address accessory dwelling unit height regulations.
Amanda, this is Tom. Just to add to that, and you were at that meeting, one of our very, very first organizing meetings of our group was that question. We raised it. Did we want to include any discussion of ADUs in the overlay? And there was a strong feeling among the group that would have been very difficult to address it in that format and very controversial. So we deliberately left any discussion of ADUs out of this overlay.
Mm-hmm. And I'll also add, I have the slide up here too. None of the changes that we're proposing actually alter the rear zone. So the lot's kind of divided into like a front 65% and a back 35%. And detached ADUs have to live in the back 35%. But these rules, except for side setbacks, wouldn't impact anything back there. And then ADUs, detached ADUs, have their own set of standards that we didn't do anything to. So we've done some looking into this and modeling, and even if, again, this is hypothetical because as the councilman said, they're not allowed currently, but the rules that would even affect how a detached ADU could be built aren't being impacted by the overlay.
Just want to time check you, Naomi. It's 10:10. I see one more question here about, does a chapter 59 area have to change to a new zoning before adopting an overlay? And I do want to just answer a question really quick. I saw a question earlier about historic significance. My understanding as a trustee of Historic Denver is that when they set a historic district, they pick a period of time of significance to peg everything to. And it's also my understanding that something has to be at least 50 years old to even be considered for this. Because I know there's been conversation about the post-World War housing that's been built in southwestern Denver and whether or not that will one day become historic or not.
Thanks, Ian. Awesome. And then Abe also put in a little bit more detail about historic districts in there as well. So thanks, Ian. Yes, I think we should move on to our next overlay. Again, if anyone has further questions, you are welcome to continue to put them in the chat and we can reach out to you later and and answer them. And also I'm going to put my email, naomi.grundwitz@denvergov.org in here. And so you can feel free to reach out to me personally if you have any further questions. And the district office email as well. That'll go to all of us. All right, I will try to move through this a little more quickly so that we have some time for Q&A, but I think you'll all be really excited about this overlay as well. Active centers and corridors design overlay. It's a bit of a mouthful. So same background. We'll talk a little bit about very briefly how this overlay differs from the other project background and then what's in it. And yes, we will send the presentations out so you guys can review them. And I think this is being recorded, right? Yep, great. So active centers and corridors overlay. This is specifically about traditional shopfront commercial corridors that in the new zoning code in 2010, they allow mixed use, but they also allow 100% residential. And if any of you have been to Tennyson Street in the last 10 years, I think you probably know the changes that we've been talking about and that the community's been so concerned about. So these discussions, and actually Christopher Johnson, who's on the call here, is our great planner from the city, has been involved with Brunn talking about this for a long time. But again, back with Councilman Espinoza, these concerns have been brought up along Tennyson, and actually in other districts as well, along South Pearl and in Santa Fe. So the overlay that we've developed with Brunn and with CPD actually is meant to also be able to apply to some of these other small scale traditional streetcar commercial nodes, as you can see here. This pattern is led to commercial areas that were very walkable, that were super mixed use, really pedestrian friendly. And so that's what this overlay is trying to preserve. So this is a design overlay, not a conservation overlay. A design overlay is meant to guide development as it changes and redevelops. It can preserve existing patterns as well, but it is even more geared towards what new development is going to look like. And again, it can't deny uses that are already allowed, but it can modify how those are arranged in buildings. And so that is how we are coming up with one of the key components of this overlay, which is to require non-residential uses on the ground floor. Which we'll get to very quickly, super fast. There's quite a few design overlays that exist already. This would be number 8. And the first area it would be mapped to would be along Tennyson. Let's see, up here, kind of in these areas. I think I have another map later on. Sorry, I'm rushing through this a little bit. So our process, again, very long, detailed process with Brunn. We've done town halls. They were right before COVID. It was like the last in-person thing that we did. We've also reached out to property owners with individual mailers, had calls with property owners, put out media advisories, and have a landing page that people can visit. Here we go. Here's the places that it would be applicable in District 1. So along Tennyson and then some of these other nodes. Again, these are all sort of those traditional streetcar commercial walkable areas. It's about 35 acres in total. And again, this wouldn't change the underlying zoning. It would just apply these extra design standards. I am actually just going to go through those real fast. So the meat of this overlay, probably the most important part of it is this part here, where we're not saying you can't have residential, but we're changing where that is arranged in a building. So this standard says that for the majority of the ground floor on a building that's built in these areas, you cannot have an actual residential, an actual dwelling unit on the ground floor. It has to be some sort of commercial for most of it. There's a little wiggle room there for kind of smaller lots and smaller storied areas and depth. And you are allowed to have, like a lobby or something to residences above. But for especially most of these larger lots that are getting redeveloped, you will have to have some sort of commercial on the ground floor. Another thing the overlay does is it eliminates these kind of drive-through forms, which are currently allowed on street corners in very specific cases, but basically saying that drive-through forms are not appropriate for a small walkable shopfront area. There's also an increase in where a building can be set relative to the sidewalk. And this is to help create space for outdoor patio seating, things like that. Currently, the standards are very limited, which is great for creating a very consistent, we call it a street wall, but also means that when, currently now outdoor dining is really important. And the only place to put it tends to be in the sidewalk, which also isn't great for people passing by. So if we have a little bit more of that wiggle room for where the building is sited, that means that there's more room for vibrant outdoor space, and it's not being shoved into walking paths for people. Here's another really important one element based on so most of the ground floor can't be residence, but in the places where it can be, if you actually do have a residence, a dwelling unit on the ground floor, there has to be a setback. That dwelling unit can't be right up to the sidewalk. There has to be some sort of outdoor space transition to the private realm, kind of like creating basically the pattern that you see in these examples down here. Another thing we did is got rid of, this is sort of a loophole, it's a little technical, but we know windows are so important. Windows on the ground floor are incredibly important for commercial spaces and just enjoying pedestrian activities along the street there. So we reduced the alternatives, basically things that can substitute for windows. We restricted that only to permanent art. This is not a great example of permanent art, but it illustrates the concept of how that space can account for windows. Permanent art is actually a really, really high standard that has to go through the Denver Arts and Venues, and it's meant for very exceptional works of art that would be on a building's wall. And then first floor height. So this is just a really good standard design practice that we're seeing happen in other parts of the zoning code and other overlays as well. Commercial space that is successful generally has taller ceiling heights. And so we actually went and I physically measured with a measuring tape the heights of the storefronts along Tennyson to help us get to these numbers. So when a new building is built, that commercial space has to have a floor-to-floor first floor height of 14 feet. That'll help the commercial uses there end up being more successful and align better with the existing commercial spaces. So that's it. It's a little bit simpler one, only 6 main elements, and happy again to open it up to Q&A. Christopher here is incredibly knowledgeable. I know we've got some of our lovely neighbors from Brunn also on the call if they want to chime in, and I'll let them go.
So I see in the questions, Christine, is it a question, the reason for creating the design overlay that requires
commercial goal, or
So it was really comes from the community. When we had the big gathering with Councilman Espinosa near Holy Family, I probably want to say it was 2016. That was something that we gathered comments, and it was a continual comment and continues to be a comment in Northwest Denver that we are losing commercial along Tennyson, and it is only turning into all residential. And the neighborhood is very nervous about losing this commercial neighborhood serving retail. So it was really what the residents and the business owners along Tennyson have asked of the council office. And in full transparency, my father used to own a building on the corner of 44th and Tennyson from 1975 to 2012. And so I know how active that corridor is. I basically grew up on that corridor, and we are losing some of our small commercial retail nodes. So the goal of this overlay is to require 70% of all new builds to have commercial, or it doesn't always have to be commercial, neighborhood serving retail.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just wondering if you're losing it, are you losing it because it's being converted into residential?
Correct.
Only
Yeah.
builds. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. And that's a really good distinction to bring up, actually, Christine. So these are thriving business spaces. There is not I mean, COVID has kind of changed everything, but hopefully, there will be a recovery. What has threatened the commercial nature and shopfront nature of these areas is not necessarily like economic loss of businesses. It's the fact that business spaces are literally being torn down and replaced with completely residential construction, not even space being provided. Of course, newer space is always going to be more expensive than older space, but the fact that the new buildings going up have radically changed the environment of the street, not even providing ground floor commercial space for the opportunity for those kind of uses to come back. That's part of what, in addition to some design factors, has been really concerning for the community and the other business owners there too, because business thrives off of other business, and getting that density of, this has been an arts corridor for so long, and yeah, there is literal loss because of forces of redevelopment coming in and removing business commercial space and not replacing it. And yes, everyone can have copies of these presentations and any other materials that we have as well.
Okay, well, that was great. So this is wonderful. We have 7 minutes left.
Yeah, any other questions about the process in general or specifically overlays?
I just had one kind of off the cuff idea. I know somebody in a ranch neighborhood that's been, just toying with this idea. I wonder if there's been any work between like similar neighborhoods to work on an overlay together, which would save money.
I'll say that we are working in Northwest Denver with similar neighborhoods. So we are currently working with the Sunnyside group on another overlay. But in my office and my practice is, unless a council member is proactive in coming to me, I really do my best not to cross my boundaries. I know that they're imaginary boundaries, but they are boundaries. So I represent and was elected by the people of Northwest Denver. And when I ran, I talked about how I really liked zoning and I wanted to impact zoning and impact Northwest Denver through zoning. So I feel like that's my charge, and I don't want to go into other neighborhoods, and I don't know the key players. I don't know who the best points of contact are, but I do know in Northwest Denver. So we have been collaborating with Councilwoman Torres and Councilman Clark on the active street use overlay. And so they've been able to share it with their respective neighborhoods, but other residential overlays, we took cues from Potter Highland one, because that's similar. But other than that, I'm really sticking within Northwest Denver. And if other council members would like to reach out, we're happy to collaborate. But Naomi and I have a pretty robust plan for 2021 as well, that hopefully what we're doing is we're implementing these tools into the zoning code and working them and really tweaking them and refining them, and then implementing them into a text amendment. And I'm mapping them to District 1. But now that they're a text, anybody can take them and use them as the foundation to build upon.
Thank you.
Chris, I have a question.
Yes,
It's Gertie Grant. Can I ask a question?
yes,
Go ahead, Gertie.
You mentioned in the bungalow one that there were a lot of architectural input. Where did you get the architects?
Sure. So they came from the neighborhood. We had Greg Sater was as an architect and resident who was very intimately involved with this. We also knew some architects that had done work in the neighborhood recently. I believe her name is Ginger Bim. She worked on several kind of pop tops in more traditional styles and was kind enough to share some of her knowledge and actually designs with us so that we could make sure stuff that she was doing wouldn't be prevented by our overlay. But yeah, I think residents, there's a lot of really great people in all our neighborhoods. There's quite a few architects. And of course, Councilman Espinoza was an architect, and as well as the firm that he brought in, Pelona, as a consultant in the beginning, they were architects as well.
So
Thank you.
Yep. When Councilman Espinosa was in office, we outsourced a lot of the work to an architecture team. And what I did is, instead of doing that, is I in-housed Naomi, who's a city planner, and then now we outsource architect work. But instead of having to have a consultant team, it ends up being a lot of work and a lot of money. And so it's a bit different. And so through the years, I've found different people to ping ideas off. And I really rely on ZAP, what's the Brun zoning. We have Robert Schmidt, who's on the line. He's an architect. And so we had Noel Copeland, who is part of the Brun overlay. He's an architect. We have Heather, who is a landscape architect, and they're all on the zoning committee. So luckily in Northwest Denver, we have a lot of architects who end up going to our planning and neighborhood community zoning meetings.
Thank you.
Okay, well, it's 10:27. There's a number of other questions popping up. I'm wondering they may be appropriate for Abe, but we want to save 5 minutes, or we'd like Abe to give Abe 5 minutes when we're finished on these two overlays. Abe, do you want to answer these, or do you want to, will it take too long?
Let's see. So the last question from Eleni was about the East Central Area Plan and addressing conservation overlays, and if there are any resources dedicated to establishing the overlays. So yeah, that's a great question and a great idea. At the moment, there isn't a dedicated funding source for overlays. I would say though that with the East Central Area Plan adopted, that's now very helpful that we have specific direction that conservation overlays are appropriate to address the objectives of that plan. And then within the plan itself, some of the objectives for the conservation overlays are already in there. So I think it would be a lot easier to have the conversation in a neighborhood that has recently had that neighborhood planning conversation. But I think it's a really good idea to also be thinking about how can we do more as a city to facilitate efforts when city council has, adopted an area plan that says there should be conservation overlays, or that that's an appropriate tool.
And Abe, I'll just add to that quickly too, that certainly city staff are available to provide resources in the terms of our time and our expertise and our ability to help neighborhoods through the process. But as far as dedicated funding coming from the city, that's not something that's currently available.
Great. Well, I think we're going to have to wind up this portion, if it's okay. I want to thank the Councilwoman for being here in person, and Naomi and Abe and Christopher. It was a wonderful presentation. Would that we were all be as lucky as District 1 to have Naomi, because your diagrams and explanations were excellent.
Oh, thank you.
I appreciate it. So thank you all. And then we wanted, before we go to around the city, we were going to give Abe Barge just 5 minutes to briefly, and this is unrelated to around the city, give us an update on what's coming with residential infill in 2021. We will not take questions though, because we're going to invite the city back in 2021 to do a more thorough presentation in January or February or whenever appropriate. So let's turn to Abe for 5 minutes, and then don't go away because we do want to do around the city. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So Christine asked me to give just a brief update. Most of you are probably aware of the residential infill project, which hasn't really started up. For those of you that aren't, I'll give you just a real brief summary of the project in a minute, but want to first, be clear that right now the project is on pause. There's nothing specifically happening. The reason for the pause is that We want to, we've really heard that residents need more time to process the things that are already going on in the city and take part of the work we're already doing to implement citywide goals, specifically around equity and affordable housing. I know a lot of the conversations around the proposed group living amendments have been really intense. We want to give that space, want everybody to be heard. When we do start up the conversation, we also want to be thinking about how the conversation will impact areas that are currently zoned former Chapter 59. There was a question about the conservation overlays in the chat as well about that, and have a good plan for that. But we do, I think, we remain committed to moving forward with the project. So for those of you that aren't aware with what the project is, it's really an effort to implement City Council adopted policy for improved access to opportunity in residential neighborhoods through offering and finding ways to offer more diverse housing choices, while also addressing common concerns about design that doesn't fit in, like with the mass scale and form of older homes in existing neighborhoods. And so, a little more specifically, that means that we're going to be looking through the very extensive conversations we'll have as part of that project to allow for preserving more naturally affordable housing in neighborhoods and gently broaden access to housing options in lower scale residential neighborhoods. That includes looking at where accessory dwelling units can be appropriate in more locations. But at the same time, I think it's going to be really important to be looking at the design side and ensuring that the design of things that are happening in neighborhoods is sensitive to the surrounding context, and that we're not doing things to, for example, encourage scraping existing homes that are really contributing to what people love about neighborhoods. And this is where, I think, interestingly, the project really overlaps with the conversations that we're having, particularly about the Bungalow Conservation Overlay. That this is really, okay, we know we need to do more citywide to ensure that the changes that are happening in neighborhoods actually fit in with those neighborhoods. So it's really a citywide effort to see, like, can we do more right from the starting gate in all neighborhoods to ensure that? And then individual neighborhoods, where we haven't gone far enough, can still be having these conservation overlay conversations. And then, finally, just relating back to that conversation about the East Central Area Plan, it's also an opportunity then to look at all of those plans specific to neighborhoods as a kind of starting point. Like, we've had all these conversations about what makes things fit in more in East Central, well, in Harkness Heights, for example. How can we take those lessons learned and apply them to similar areas citywide? I think that'll be a really great part of the conversation. And then just in terms of timing, what we've been saying is that the project is on hold in terms of kicking off until 2021. 2021 is now a month away. So what I would say is it's not the first month or two of 2021 at this point. We're again trying to give space for these other conversations. We haven't made the decision about startup. When we do, you all will be the first to know. And we're going to start the conversations off slowly. We're a long ways away from any proposals. We need to do a lot of talking first.
Okay, well, thank you, Abe. I think that's great. I know there'll be questions, but I think we're going to move on.